Biology is a science. To many of you who don't know science per se, evolved perhaps 150 years ago. Now, to understand biology, you have to understand what science is. And science is nothing more than a process. So today what we will do is we will look at the overall process of the scientific method, and from there we will go and look at the characteristics of life that we will be studying throughout the entire semester. First of all, the scientific method, which is a process that evolved probably at the time of Louis Pasteur. And we'll talk about an experiment that Louis Pasteur did about 150 years ago. But the scientific method is an organized way of explaining natural phenomena. In the scientific method, we put together an experiment with appropriate controls, and we monitor the experiment, and we collect data. Data is basically numbers. The more numbers you have, the more objective your data is going to be. Now, once you put all of this together, we come through with conclusions, and your conclusions, you have to understand, are tentative, because with time, someone else will come in and change that somewhat. Einstein's work that he had done over the years is continuously being revised and continuously being changed, with all due respect to the genius that Einstein had. Let's look at the scientific method in more detail. When something occurs in nature that needs explanation, the first thing one does is you look and you make your observation. You make your observation, you gather some information, and then that leads you to a question as to what is causing this particular event, this particular scenario. Well, what happens next with the scientist is that he will develop an educated guess to try to explain what is happening in nature. Now, once he develops this educated guess, he will go and formulate an experiment. Now, the experimental model did not come into being until about 150 years ago. And in the experimental model, what we do is put together a scenario where we're able to test to see whether we can prove or disprove a given hypothesis. Now, once we put an experimental model together, we are determined to gather as much information to explain, that is, to prove or disprove a given hypothesis. We then obtain the results, which is data, and from the results, we carefully draw our conclusions. Now, our conclusions have to be objectives, and normally what a scientist does is publishes those conclusions. Those conclusions often are published in a reputable journal, and with time, if those conclusions are repeated by other scientists, guess what? We come up with a theory. Yes, a theory is quite different than what you thought it was. A theory is based on significant scientific research. After theory has been around for a long time and has been proven over and over again and modified and revised and so on, guess what? It becomes a law. So if you look at, for example, Einstein's theory of relativity, Einstein's theory of E is equal to mc squared, it is continuously being revised so that with time it will become a law or fact. But the reality in biology, there are few facts and few laws. Let's carefully look, as you can see on the illustration, of the work that was done by the eminent father of microbiology, Louis Pasteur. Now, in Louis Pasteur days, there was a concept called spontaneous generation, which many of you have never heard of. Spontaneous generation is a theory in those days that stipulated that life originates spontaneously from non-life. Spontaneous generation. Now, in those days, there was a reward given to anyone who could disprove the concept of spontaneous generation. Today we know, of course, that's nonsense. But Louis Pasteur took upon himself to disprove the concept of spontaneous generation using the scientific method. So what Pasteur did was put together a very unique flask called Swan Neck flask. Within it, he put sterile broth which had no living material. If you let this flask sit for a period of time, there was no growth. Why? Because anything from the outside that would come in would land at the trap within the flask, and nothing would come inside the broth and contaminate the flask. So, if you continued the process and then broke off the top of the flask, material from the outside came in and growth occurred. Therefore, proving that bugs from the outside were coming in and contaminating the flask. On the bottom side, if he even turned the flask left and right, he would also get growth. So in conclusion, what Pasteur showed that the only way life evolves is through a process where other life contribute to that evolutionary process. So therefore, spontaneous generation was disproven, and Louis Pasteur became a folk hero. So now that we understand the scientific method, let's hope we can utilize the scientific method during the entire course as we try to explain interesting phenomena. But let's get to the main part of our lecture today. Characteristics of life. Basically, what is life? If you found yourself on planet X and someone asked you, is there life there? How would you answer that question? Does it move? Does it jump up and down at you? Does it make faces at you? Really, how would you determine whether something is alive? Let's look at the characteristics of life. All living things, whether they are large or small, will demonstrate all of the characteristics that you see on this slide. First of all living things require energy. To require energy for a lot of things, for building, for breaking down, and so on. All living things maintain a process called homeostasis. And homeostasis, as we'll learn, is a process for maintaining balance. Internal chemical balance, external chemical balance. And we'll talk about this in a moment. All living things carry out reproduction. Life has to reproduce, otherwise, obviously, it disappears. All living things will respond to stimuli. If I shine a small light on an amoeba, the amoeba might move towards the light or away from the light. If I kick a frog, the frog is going to jump. Absolutely. All living things will respond to stimuli, and in relationship to that, all living things carry out a process called adaptation. Now, adaptation is a process that we will talk much more about when we talk about evolution. All living things have a common genetic code imprinted in a molecule that we will learn a lot about called DNA. And the DNA in the frog, and the DNA in the amoeba, and the DNA in you, believe it or not, have a common genetic code, which probably you may deduce means that all of life probably evolved from one single point about 3.8 billion years ago. And finally, all living things maintain organization. All living things will be organized in a structural environment that can easily be determined. Let's look at organization, because that's a major part of all living organisms. If you look at the slide, you can see that the smallest part of the organization of life starts with the atom. The atoms come together to form molecules. Molecules come together to form complex structures called organelle. And organelle will come together to form even more complex structures called the cell. The cell is the basic unit of all living things. Now, of course, we have different types of cells in a given organism, and different cells come together to form tissue. Tissues will have similar cells for a common function. Different tissues come together to form organs. As you can see, the heart is made up of a variety of tissue. The heart is made up of lipid tissue, muscle tissue, nerve tissue, fibrous tissue, and so on and so on. Now, many organs come together to form organ systems, which is not illustrated on your slide. And organ systems like the respiratory system, the reproductive system, the immune system, all come together to form an organism. And from an ecological point of view, the organisms come together to form populations. Populations come together to form communities, and communities all form basically the ecosystems, and the ecosystems, the largest, of course, is being the biosphere per se. We will talk much more about this aspect of organization when we discuss ecology, but I want you to get an appreciation for the complexity of and the beauty of the organizational system of all living things. We've just touched on the different characteristics of life. I want you to understand, no matter how small an organism is, how simple it is, a simple amoeba, a bacteria, that it will have the same characteristic and all of the characteristics of life that a complex organism like an elephant might have. Now, we have briefly looked at the characteristics of life, but I want to impress upon you that throughout the rest of the semester, we're going to be looking at each of these characteristics, not necessarily broken down one by one, because many of the chapters we will look at will integrate different characteristics and so on. But by the time we're done, you will have a tremendous appreciation for how all these characteristics come together to form what we call life.